Teach 'em, pale-faced brother, all about Red Man.
Good. This should be most delightful.
Native Americans were people with spiritual beliefs, tying them to their lands. When colonists discovered the New World, they saw this as a waste of resources and found the indigenous to be uncivilized. For years, the Europeans tried to coexist with the natives by civilizing them. A boundary developed where whites were civilized and the Native Americans were not. This feeling of false superiority made it impossible to accept their culture, resulting in a bloody history of exile and oppression.
Throughout history, Native Americans have been forcefully removed from their homelands, leaving behind cultural traditions and ancestral roots. Without second thought, colonists and later the United States government implemented a system that separated themselves from the perceived savages, the reservation system. Throughout the 19th century, during the nation's westward expansion, plots of land were given to the natives by the federal government with the intent of diminishing tensions between the Native Americans and U.S. settlers. Tribes of Native Americans living on these reservations were partially sovereign, and their governments managed local affairs. These reservations were placed under the jurisdiction of their respective tribal governments, separating the United States nation from those of the Native American tribes.
From the mid-19th century through the 20th century, the United States federal government bounced between a policy of Indian sovereignty and one of assimilation into the American culture. The Dawes Act, passed in 1887, tried to assimilate the Native Americans into the American capitalist culture by distributing reservations as private land to families and disbanding tribal governments. However, in the 1930s, President Franklin D. Roosevelt created the Indian Reorganization Act, which brought together tribal governments and distributed more lands for reservations. FDR, known for his New Deal for the American economy, had a comparable policy for Native Americans that increased government funding for education and social services. As consistently as a pendulum, the United States government's Native American policy has switched between sovereignty and assimilation.
The inconsistent policies of the U.S. government, along with its broken treaties, make the Native Americans feel betrayed and helpless in society. This results in a defeatist attitude that leads to self-destructive acts, such as alcoholism and suicide, that are unnecessarily abundant on reservations. Native Americans throughout the U.S. feel ignored by the federal government, and it is for this reason it has become an overwhelming problem.
But what really gets me angry is I write about it a lot, and people assume it's a stereotype. When anybody uses that word to describe alcoholism among Native Americans as a stereotype, that's what really gets me angry. It's a disavowal of the truth. Alcoholism is epidemic among Native Americans, and anybody who says otherwise is either drunk or they're lying or they're romantic fools.
These social issues are known to be the result of a legacy of unresolved grief spanning over many generations. This phenomenon is known as historically unresolved grief and contributes to this immeasurable problem in Native American society. With no room for exaggeration, these issues originated from the loss of Native lives, land, and culture.
So what is done about these injustices? What does the federal government do to aid these people? Federal funding for the reservations accounts for almost 90% of the economic survival of the reservations. In attempting to refine Native American policy, President Barack Obama, adopted by the Crow Nation as Barack Black Eagle, held a meeting in November of 2009 with over 500 of the federally recognized tribes to discuss their conditions. This was the largest federal gathering of tribes in over 20 years and is proof of the United States attempting to live up to the promises it had made long ago.
My American Indian policy begins with creating a bond between an Obama administration and the nations all across this country. We need more than just a government-to-government relationship. We need a nation-to-nation relationship, and I will make sure that tribal nations have a voice in the White House. I'll appoint an American Indian policy advisor to my senior White House staff to work with tribes and host an annual summit at the White House with tribal leaders to come up with an agenda that works for tribal communities. That's how we'll make sure you have a seat at the table when important decisions are being made about your lives, about your nations, and about your people.
The northern neighbor of Washington, Vancouver, Canada, also has reservations, but has a very different Native American policy. The tourist locations and the plastering of the orca onto water bottles may seem derogatory. However, the prevalence of the culture in the general city makes their transition into Canadian society easier. The culture is also preserved in other ways. The anthropology department at the University of British Columbia, outside of Vancouver, has a museum featuring the different Aboriginal cultures of Canada, including their totem poles, languages, and other tribal rituals. These rituals are still in practice today, with more totem poles and stories beginning, and languages in use, as seen in the 2010 Olympic opening ceremony.
On behalf of the Musqueam Nation, welcome! Bienvenue!
Although Native American languages may seem unimportant, and therefore expendable, they encapsulate something much broader, their ancestry. Throughout the nation, many tribes fear that their languages will soon be extinct. Having been forced to live on reservations, the Native Americans had no choice other than to become civilized people, forced to forget their culture and traditions. If they were caught speaking their native languages, they were scolded and even beaten. Due to such aggression, only few Native Americans in the U.S. still speak the language of their ancestors. We must act to preserve their languages and support the history of those who lived there, long before it was even discovered.
Sometimes the language defines us in a different sort of way than can be done with English. We have a law. We have a way. We are, in a sense, civilized in that way. Maybe not on the grander scale, but we are a people. And if we lost the language, maybe we lose the heart of that.